In this story, the deepest paradox lies in one unsettling truth. The victim and the perpetrator are not separated by two different names. History prefers clear roles, neat divisions between guilt and innocence. But with William I, that boundary blurs in a way that is almost painful to witness. He is both the man who created fear and the one who ultimately paid the price for the path he chose. William was not born into glory, but into scorn. He entered the world as an illegitimate child, carrying a stain long before he could even understand what the world was. His childhood held no carefree games, no real sense of protection. He grew up beside a mother of low social standing in a rigid feudal society, surrounded by silent, contemptuous glances. From a very early age, William learned a single brutal lesson to survive. He would have to build himself a hardened shell. At just 8 years old, William became the ruler of Normandy. A child standing at the center of a storm of power, betrayal, and ruthless competition. At an age when other children were still being taught how to trust, William had to learn how to doubt everyone. In that world, kindness was not a strength, but a fatal weakness. These circumstances shaped a William who was cold, controlling, and constantly haunted by the fear of being stripped of what little he had. Yet if we see William only as a tyrant, the story becomes far too simple. Beneath the cloak of power lived a man consumed by a hunger for recognition. William did not merely want to rule. He wanted to be seen as legitimate, deserving, irreplaceable. Every victory, every expansion of territory, was a way for him to prove that the boy once dismissed and humiliated had risen above his fate. William's deepest dream was not the throne itself, but absolute security. Security against betrayal. Security against contempt. Security against being cast aside the same way he had been treated as a child. Tragically, the more he pursued that security through power and fear, the further he pushed himself away from his own humanity. Surrounding William were countless relationships that appeared solid: nobles, generals, clergy, men who had once knelt before him. But these bonds were built on interest and fear, not on loyalty. As long as power remained, they stayed. When power weakened, those ties dissolved just as quickly. Most dangerous of all, William seemed either unable or unwilling to see this truth. On the other side, the perpetrator of this story has no physical form. It is not a man standing opposite William. The true perpetrator is boundless ambition, the belief that total control can bring peace, the illusion that fear can replace love and respect. That force grew with every victory, every hard decision, every moment when William chose repression over listening. The relationships around him, from the royal court to the common people, became mirrors reflecting a disturbing reality. No one truly stayed because William was William. They stayed because of the crown. And when the crown could no longer shield him, William found himself more alone than ever before. In the final moment, when power could no longer speak on his behalf, William appears as a stripped-down human being. Not a conqueror. Not a symbol. Just a man who had lived his entire life afraid of losing everything, and who ultimately lost the one thing that mattered most: genuine human connection. In this story, the victim is not only a dead king. The victim is a human being slowly worn down by the very path he chose. And the perpetrator, more terrifying than any external enemy, is what was quietly nurtured within him over the course of a lifetime. In the summer of 1087, northern France was weighed down by a heavy, oppressive atmosphere. Prolonged campaigns had worn down not only the army, but also the body and spirit of a king who had already passed the peak of his life. William I, then encamped near the town of Mantes, was no longer the man of relentless conquest he had once been. He was heavier, slower, yet he still insisted on being physically present on the battlefield, as if power itself could exist only so long as he stood there in person. That fateful day began like any other. In the morning, the mist had not yet fully lifted from the fields on the outskirts of town. William put on his armor and mounted his horse with practiced familiarity, though those closest to him could clearly see the exhaustion etched into his face. This was not a major battle, but a march meant to intimidate, an action more symbolic than strategic. It was precisely that sense of overconfidence that opened the door to a turning point from which there would be no return. As the troops moved through uneven terrain, the air suddenly grew chaotic. Horses neighed, commands echoed through the wind. In a brief, almost imperceptible instant, the horse William was riding reared up. Not because of an arrow, not because of a direct attack, but simply from an animal's instinctive reaction amid tension and noise. For a body already burdened by weight and imbalance, a single second of lost control was enough to bring everything crashing down. William fell. There was no thunderous cry, no heroic spectacle of a ruler collapsing in glory. There was only a violent impact and a terrifying moment of silence, as those around him realized the king was not getting up. He was quickly carried away from the scene, his face twisted in pain, yet he forced himself to remain silent, as though admitting weakness was something he could not allow. In the days that followed, William was taken to Rouen, where he remained in an enclosed space, cut off from the battlefield. 6 weeks passed slowly, like an extended sentence. Time was no longer measured in days or nights, but in waves of pain that came and went, in moments of clarity mixed with delirium. The physicians of the time were helpless before his condition, not for lack of effort, but because the limits of medieval medicine, combined with the king's own failing body, locked away any real hope. Inside that room, power no longer worked. No command could make the pain stop. No throne could shield him from the fear that rose with each passing hour. William, the man who had once made an entire kingdom tremble, was now reduced to a human being facing the starkest truth of all: no one can conquer death. The people around him began to thin out. Counts, nobles, men who had once sworn loyalty quietly departed, citing duties, or offering no reason at all. In the increasingly empty room, William began to speak more. He recalled his campaigns, his unforgiving decisions, the moments that might have turned out differently. These were not confessions, but the belated reflections of someone who had gone too far to turn back. On a cold autumn day, in September of 1087, as the light outside the window slowly faded, William I breathed his last. There was no grand ceremony. No bells rang throughout the city. Only silence spread, as if history itself paused to mark the end of a man who had once stood at the very summit of power. And from that moment on, the true case began. Not the case of his death, but the case of what followed once power was no longer there to keep everyone in place. It was a bleak afternoon in September of 1087, in the city of Rouen, just as autumn was beginning to take hold. The bad news was not announced by church bells or royal ceremony. Instead, it spread quietly, almost furtively. A young servant, his face drained of color, hurried out of the residence where William I had drawn his final breath, and ran to alert the city guards. There was no emergency call in the modern sense, only the raw, unfiltered panic of human beings confronted with the death of a king. The first people summoned were members of the royal guard and a handful of local clergy. They entered the room where William lay with a mixture of caution and disbelief. This was not a chaotic crime scene. There were no cries of mourning, no crowd gathering outside the door. Instead, what filled the space was an unsettling emptiness, as though all life had withdrawn along with power itself. From the perspective of one of the first guards to step inside, the room felt cold and drained of vitality. The last light of day filtered through a narrow window, falling across the large bed where the king's body lay motionless. No courtiers stood watch. No trusted companions bowed their heads. The familiar objects of a king were still there, but the man who had owned them had been left utterly alone. The first emotion was not fear, but confusion. Those present quickly sensed something was wrong. No one was in charge. There were no official orders, no plan for funeral rites. Even those who had once sworn loyalty were nowhere to be found. In the minds of the guards, a quiet doubt began to form. Was this truly the ending a king was meant to have? They scanned the room, searching for signs of interference or conspiracy. But the scene offered none. Everything was too still, too ordinary in a way that felt deeply unsettling. It was that very ordinariness that disturbed them most. One guard later recalled that he had never witnessed a death so lonely, especially not for a man who had once made an entire kingdom tremble. The clergy exchanged glances, whispering among themselves about their sacred duty to arrange the final rites. Yet even they hesitated. For this scene was not merely the place where a man had died. It was living proof of the total collapse of power once breath had left the body. As night fell over Rouen, the room remained lit. Not to guard a king, but to remind those who stood there that this case did not lie in how William died, but in how the world treated him in the moments immediately after. When William I died in Rouen in September of 1087, there was no official investigation in the modern sense. Yet history makes clear that a quiet, prolonged, and highly tense process of verification did take place, carried out by those responsible for preserving the order of royal authority. This was not merely about clarifying the death of one man, but about safeguarding the stability of an entire kingdom. In the very first hours after the king drew his final breath, the royal guards and senior clergy were instructed to remain. They did not call it taking statements, but each person was required to recount precisely their location, timing, and actions during William's final days. Who left early? Who stayed until the end? Who had direct contact with the king? And who was conspicuously absent? These questions were asked, and asked again in closed exchanges designed to eliminate the possibility that interference or conspiracy had taken place during his last hours. Acting in a role equivalent to what we would now call a preliminary investigation, officials from both church and court reviewed the king's travel records. Letters, handwritten orders, and the notes of royal scribes were brought together and cross-checked. They showed that William had suffered serious injury during the campaign at Manse, and that his condition steadily worsened over time. There was no record of unfamiliar individuals gaining access to him in his final days. That consistency gradually pushed aside the theory of outside intervention. If modern investigators rely on security cameras, then in the 11th century the cameras were living witnesses. Servants, guards, monks, and physicians all became lenses through which events were recalled. They were questioned about the smallest details: who entered the room, who left, whether anything unusual appeared in anyone's behavior or words. Though fragmented, their answers combined into a relatively coherent picture. William declined gradually, with no signs of external interference. The next stage of the inquiry resembled what we would now describe as forensic examination, even though the concept did not yet exist. Physicians were asked to describe the king's physical condition before his death. They had no knowledge of DNA, no modern testing methods, only direct observation and the limited medical experience of the medieval world. Accounts of prolonged pain, physical deterioration, and abnormal symptoms were carefully noted. There was no indication of foreign substances or unnatural intervention. By the standards of the time, this was considered significant evidence. Had there been deliberate interference, it would likely have left traces clear enough to arouse suspicion among the physicians. Instead, everything they observed aligned with the natural progression of a severe injury, compounded by a body long worn down. In a society without fingerprints or electronic records, data meant spoken testimony, written documents, and collective memory. William's decrees and correspondence from the final weeks of his life were examined for signs of mental instability. No sudden change appeared in tone or content. This further reinforced the conclusion that the king remained lucid, was not being manipulated, and that his death was not the result of a hidden plot. Alongside the effort to clarify his final days, the inquiry expanded into William's past. This step resembles what we would now call a review of prior behavior. Royal advisors revisited his entire life, not to pass judgment, but to assess whether he had faced serious internal threats. Rebellions, political enemies, and nobles who had once been suppressed were all listed and considered. The findings showed that William had many enemies, but no precedent suggested attempts to eliminate him through covert means. Previous conflicts had been open, conducted through armies and authority, rather than secret schemes. This made the hypothesis of a hidden act of intervention increasingly weak. By the end of the verification process, those responsible reached a cautious conclusion. William's death was not the result of a deliberate act by an external party. Yet the investigation did not end there. A larger question still hovered unanswered. Why did the entire system around him collapse so quickly after his death? The focus therefore shifted from identifying a specific perpetrator to recording a colder truth. William's power existed while he lived, but it did not leave behind a network of loyalty strong enough to protect him once he was gone. Statements, documents, and scattered observations ultimately converged on a sobering conclusion. There was no conspiracy, no visible killer, only a logical chain of events leading to a lonely end. And it is within that ending that history begins to ask deeper questions, ones that extend beyond the limits of any ordinary investigation. Those questions concern motive, underlying cause, and After William I died, the investigation quickly ran into an unsettling reality. There was no perpetrator left at the scene. Those who should have borne direct responsibility for guarding, caring for, and arranging the king's final rites had all disappeared. Their departure was not loud, nor did it leave obvious traces. Yet it was enough for court officials to realize that a kind of escape had taken place. Not the flight of a single individual, but the withdrawal of an entire system. In a role similar to identifying a fleeing suspect, royal officials began compiling lists of those whose absence seemed abnormal, who left Rouen immediately after the king's death, who gathered property, weapons, horses, or boats without authorization, who vanished from the duties they had been assigned. This was the crude yet effective escape plan: withdraw quickly before central authority could re-establish itself. Efforts to track them down followed the methods of the age. Letters were dispatched across the territories, ordering local lords to report any appearance of individuals formerly close to William. River routes along the Seine and major trade corridors were monitored. This was not an attempt to capture a murderer, but an effort to force those who had fled to return and face responsibility. The moment of capture in this case did not come with chains or force. It came through legal and moral accusation. Some individuals were summoned back and questioned by both church and court. In closed interrogations, they were required to explain why they had left, why they had failed to fulfill their obligations, and what role they had played in the king's final days. From there, a record of prosecution in administrative and religious terms began to take shape. Written accounts were submitted to medieval authorities of judgment, namely the church and councils of nobles, to review responsibility and determine appropriate consequences. Additional inquiries were conducted to strengthen the record, re-examining correspondence, testimony, and indirect evidence of negligence. In the end, the preparation for judgment did not aim at a criminal sentence, but at establishing historical accountability. No one was convicted for William's death. Yet many names were entered into the record of abandonment, so that future generations would understand one thing clearly in this case: the perpetrator was not caught by force, but exposed by the truth itself. When all testimonies had been gathered, and the theories of outside interference were gradually set aside, the investigation moved into a darker, harder-to-name territory. The motive did not lie in a single act, but in an entire lifetime. William I was not brought down by an enemy standing before him. He was pushed toward that end by the very way he built and maintained his power. The first truth to emerge was that William ruled more through fear than through genuine bonds. Those around him remained for advantage, for pressure, for status, not for loyalty born of respect. This explains why, the moment power was no longer present, that network collapsed at once. No one wished to risk staying beside a king who could no longer protect them. The deeper motive lay in William's obsession with control. From a childhood marked by scorn, he formed the belief that only absolute power could guarantee safety. Every campaign, every uncompromising decision, was an attempt to patch a sense of insecurity that never truly healed. Yet this very pursuit cost him the ability to build lasting relationships rooted in mutual trust. The second truth, and the most bitter of all, is that William outlived his own authority. When he was strong, he was revered. When he weakened, he became a burden. There was no assassination, no hand that directly caused his death, but there was a collective abandonment that had been quietly unfolding long before his final days. In the end, the investigation reached a conclusion that was never written as a formal verdict, but was etched into history. The perpetrator in this case was not a person, but a model of power stripped of humanity. William was not only a victim of fate, but also a victim of the very choices he believed would ensure his survival. And that is the truth behind it all. There was no formal trial for William, the first in the way modern history imagines justice. Yet, after all suspicions had been addressed, a different kind of judgment still took place, not in a grand courtroom, but in the collective memory of the court, the church, and future generations. This was history's trial, where no one was bound in chains, yet no one could escape judgment. The council of nobles and representatives of the church, those who held power after William's death, convened to review the entire sequence of events. They examined records, testimonies, correspondence, and the medical accounts of the time. Every theory of deliberate interference was raised, then gradually dismissed. There was no evidence that William had been murdered, no sign of a carefully orchestrated conspiracy. The focus of this trial slowly shifted. The question was no longer who caused the death, but who bore responsibility for the total collapse of order that followed. Officials who had left, those who abandoned their duties, and those who exploited the vacuum of power to protect their own interests were summoned and questioned. They were not convicted in a criminal sense, but they were formally recorded as having failed in their obligations to a king who, while alive, had held absolute authority. In the end, the council reached an official conclusion. William's death was the natural result of accident and physical exhaustion, with no criminal element involved. Yet that conclusion carried a colder judgment alongside it. William I had placed himself in a position of isolation, one in which no one was willing to stand up and defend his honor once he fell. That was the final verdict, written not in ink, but etched by time itself. There was no formal trial for William I, in the way modern history imagines justice. Yet after all suspicions had been addressed, a different kind of judgment still took place, not in a grand courtroom, but in the collective memory of the court, the church, and future generations. This was history's trial, where no one was bound in chains, yet no one could escape judgment. The council of nobles and representatives of the church, those who held power after William's death, convened to review the entire sequence of events. They examined records, testimonies, correspondence, and the medical accounts of the time. Every theory of deliberate interference was raised, then gradually dismissed. There was no evidence that William had been murdered, no sign of a carefully orchestrated conspiracy. The focus of this trial slowly shifted. The question was no longer who caused the death, but who bore responsibility for the total collapse of order that followed. Officials who had left, those who abandoned their duties, and those who exploited the vacuum of power to protect their own interests were summoned and questioned. They were not convicted in a criminal sense, but they were formally recorded as having failed in their obligations to a king who, while alive, had held absolute authority. In the end, the council reached an official conclusion. William's death was the natural result of accident and physical exhaustion, with no criminal element involved. Yet that conclusion carried a colder judgment alongside it. William I had placed himself in a position of isolation, one in which no one was willing to stand up and defend his honor once he fell. That was the final verdict, written not in ink, but etched by time itself. The death of William I did not merely close a reign. It left a profound psychological void in both English and Norman society. For the court, it marked a period of instability during which power had to be redistributed quickly to prevent chaos. For the people, it signaled the end of a rule defined by fear, while opening a new anxiety about an uncertain future. The greatest consequence did not lie in politics, but in historical memory. William is remembered as a man who transformed England, yet also as proof that power without genuine connection leaves fractures that cannot be repaired. The neglect of his body, the disorderly funeral, and the repeated disturbance of his tomb in later years were not coincidences. They were the direct result of a life spent building authority through pressure rather than trust. The lessons drawn from this case transcend time. First, power can create order, but only respect creates endurance. William controlled territory, but he never controlled human emotion or memory. Second, fear may force obedience, but it cannot make people stay when advantage disappears. Ultimately, the story of William I stands as a warning. A person may conquer an entire kingdom, yet still fail to build humane and lasting relationships. When a life comes to an end, what remains is not titles or victories, but how one is treated when no longer able to give orders. And that, above all, is the fairest sentence history can deliver.